Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Cameron Howard.
And gasp, you might not have been expecting that as the co-host introduction, but that is because we have one of the OG hosts of the Enter the Bible podcast. If you go back to season 1, Cameron was on here quite a lot, co-hosting today. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for co-hosting with us, Cameron.
Thanks for having me. I really have to give credit, though, to Kathryn. Kathryn is the OG host.
Okay.
She was hosting before I was, then I took a turn.
Okay, I think I had forgotten that bit of Enter the Bible lore legend.
That's right.
Right here. But Cameron is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary. And if you were hearing another voice in the background, indeed, it's Kathryn Schifferdecker, usually the co-host of this iteration of the podcast. But today she is our special guest. So welcome, Kathryn.
Thank you. Thank you, Katie. And thanks, Cameron, for co-hosting this.
Glad to be here.
And Kathryn, of course, is a professor of Old Testament here at Luther Seminary as well. So we're in this sort of, extra special, unique arrangement here for the podcast because we have a question that came in that happens to be an area where Kathryn is an expert. And so we thought, okay, we'll ask Kathryn the questions, and Cameron also knows more about these sorts of things than I do, as they're both Old Testament folks. But this question came in from our website, and if you would like to ask a question, you may do so at enterthebible.org. Click on the little button up there that says ask a question, and there's a form, and you can fill it out, and we try to get to as many of these as we can. The question is pretty broad, but I think important, and that is, what is the main theme of the Book of Esther? And Kathryn, you're working on a commentary on Esther right now, right?
I am. I'm writing a commentary for a publisher called Erdman's, and it's way overdue. So I'm hoping to finish it this summer. But yes, I'm writing a commentary on the Book of Esther. So I guess I hesitate to call myself an expert on Esther, but let's just say I've spent a lot of time on it in the past few years. So so hopefully I have something interesting to contribute to this question. But Cameron has written on Esther as well, so we'll have a conversation here rather than a monologue. And obviously, we usually have a conversation. So the main theme of the Book of Esther. It's an interesting question, and you're right, Katie, that it's a broad question. And I think it probably comes out of the fact that Esther is a pretty atypical biblical book, right? I mean, it's well, first of all, it's one of the few biblical books named after a woman, right, including Ruth. Song of Songs isn't named after a woman, but it has a strong female voice. But Esther's pretty unique because it never mentions God, right? God is famously never mentioned in the Book of Esther. Neither are things like prayer or, prayer or, Thanksgiving or worship. None of that is mentioned in the Book of Esther. So that's, I think, probably part of what that question comes out of, because it's hard to find a Sunday school lesson in Esther. There's a couple of other kind of issues with the book. One is that it ends with pretty extreme violence. The Jewish heroes of the story instruct the other Jewish folks in the land of Persia to have vengeance on their enemies. So tens of thousands of people are killed, the enemies of the Jews, at the end of the book. And the third problem, or I don't want to say problem, but the third issue in the Book of Esther is that the way it starts is with this kind of beauty contest, but put air quotes around beauty contest because there's some pretty, suggestive sexual themes in that contest as well. So for all of these reasons, I think the Book of Esther is kind of unique in the Old Testament. I should add, I'm talking about the Hebrew version of the Book of Esther because there's a Greek version as well. The Greek translation or the Greek version is in the Septuagint, which is, of course, the Greek translation of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And in the Septuagint version of Esther, there are prayers, there's visions from dreams from God. It kind of makes up for that absence of the mention of God in the Hebrew text.
Someone looked at it and was like, "Oh, this will never do."
That's right.
We've got to fix that.
That's right. I should say that the story of Esther is set in the time of ancient Near Eastern Empire, specifically in the time and the land of Persia, the time of the Persian Empire, the land of Persia, which is almost 2,500 years ago. But when it's written is, probably sometime after that, though the author seems to know some Persian customs, like the mail system in Persia is mentioned and other details about the Persian Empire. So there seems to be some firsthand knowledge of the history of it. I would not, though, classify Esther as a historical, as history. I would classify it as kind of a historical fiction in the sense that there are some interesting, as I said, details about the Persian Empire that seem to be historical or that actually were part of the customs and the culture there. But there's no record of a queen named Esther, a Jewish queen in the Persian Empire. And there's also just a lot of kind of exaggeration or hyperbole in the book that seems to encourage a reading that is more of, I don't want to say fiction or myth, but not to be taken completely literally.
Well, it's almost
just as
satire,
one example, and then I'll stop talking for a minute.
It's almost satirical, though, right? Oh, sorry.
What's that?
I was going to say it's almost satire, right?
It is, yeah, it is. I mean, one example is that the stake or the gallows that the bad guy Haman builds for Mordecai, the good guy, is 75 feet tall, right? So, and it can either, some translations have it as gallows, something to hang on. Some, I would translate it as a stake, that it. A long spear, basically, that's meant to impale Mordecai. But yeah, 75 feet tall. Again, just meant to be kind of satire, meant to invoke some humor. All right. So I probably talked enough. What would you add, awesome, Cameron, about the interesting aspects of Esther?
Well, yeah, first of all, that it's really funny. So just echoing the idea that it can be classified as satire, we might call it macabre humor. There's certainly a lot of violence in it. There's violence in that all of the virgins of Susa are brought into the king's palace and it's basically like a sex contest. Whoever pleases the king overnight is the one who will be the queen. And so there's sexual violence. There's the threat against the Jews first, of the complete annihilation of the Jews. And so that then, the response, the first response, and there are a couple, right, that couple of rounds of what the king says should be done in response. But it ends up first being that they should defend themselves. But there's this irony there that the king can't undo the thing that has already been, he's supposed to be so powerful, and yet this edict that he sent out can't just be taken back or undone or canceled out. There's a way that the king, even though he is the king, is never quite able to do things right or read a situation well, or he's always having to go to his advisors. Yeah, so there's a lot of exaggeration that pokes fun at the king's leadership and authority there.
He's
And I think,
he's really kind of a buffoon, the king, right? He can't make up his own mind. He gets so mad that he, can't decide what to do, and very easily influenced by people. Yeah. Sorry, Cameron, I interrupted.
well, I was thinking about the question, what is the main theme? And I think if you ask that about any biblical book, you'll get as many answers as you have respondents. What is the main theme? So one of the main themes, I think, is what it means to live faithfully under the reign of this foreign empire, living in diaspora, that is, as a Jew outside the land. How does one relate to this foreign power? And that is a powerful theme in many places in the Hebrew Bible for the post-exilic era, that is, after the exile to Babylon, when Jews begin to form communities outside of the land of Judah. How does one understand identity when you don't have a temple or are not there in the land that had been promised?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's certainly one of the themes, or one of the issues that the book addresses, because the Jewish people are outside the land, well, certainly over the course of history, more than they are in the land. So how do you maintain your identity? How do you remain faithful when you're in a strange land? I think that's exactly right, Cameron. I would probably add two more, and I think Cameron's right that the main theme depends on who's interpreting it. But I would say one other theme is discipleship, which sounds a little strange to apply to a kind of satirical book like Esther. But I'll explain that in a second. And I think the second theme I would say is the faithfulness of God, which again might be a weird thing to say since we've already established that God isn't mentioned in the book. But let me just say a bit about each of those. Discipleship in the sense of Esther's courage in doing what she's called to do by Mordecai. So just to remind our listeners, right, there's Esther becomes queen.
She wins the contest.
Wins the contest. Yes, we'll skip over those details.
Good for her.
So she's queen, and then Haman has a grudge against Mordecai because Mordecai is Esther's cousin, right, older cousin who raised her. Haman has a grudge against Mordecai because Mordecai won't bow down to him, won't show him, the respect that Haman thinks that he's due. And so Haman decides not to kill just Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people, right? The whole Jewish population of Persia. Word comes, the king, the buffoonish king, is persuaded to do that. And Mordecai, sorry, I keep saying that, Haman, Haman sounds a lot like when he's trying to persuade the king to do this deed, to issue this decree to destroy the Jews. Haman says, "There's a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction." Now that sounds a whole lot like things that have been said about the Jews through the centuries since then, right? There's a certain people in your kingdom, and they don't, they're not really Germans, or they're not really Russians, or that, and so they should be driven out or killed. And that's what the king agrees to happen to the Jews. Mordecai then comes to Esther, or sends a message to Esther, and says, "Look, you need to do something about this because your people are in danger." And at first Esther refuses, or is very reluctant, because she says, the king hasn't called me into his presence, and if I go unbidden, then I could be killed. And probably the most famous line in the Book of Esther is when Mordecai responds, if you refuse to do this, you and your father's household will die, but help will come from another place, from another quarter, to save the Jews. But who knows? And I'm paraphrasing here. Who knows? Perhaps it was for just such a time as this that you became queen, or that you came to royal power. And so Mordecai really kind of tells Esther not to Christianize it too much, but to take up her cross, right? To do what needs to be done in order to save her people, even at risk of losing her life. And Esther's response is, "Okay, I'll do that, and but fast for me, and I'll fast and prepare myself. And if I perish, then I perish." So I just see, that theme of kind of courage and what I would call discipleship, not Christian discipleship, but the kind of courage to sacrifice yourself for a larger cause, in this case, to save her people. So that's one theme I see in it. And why don't I stop there, and I'll get back to my second theme, the faithfulness of God, in case you guys want to say anything about that.
Yeah, no, I think I think that verse is the one that people know. Like, how many times, if you ever hear a sermon on Esther, is it absolutely always going to be a sermon about that particular verse in particular? It does seem to be, kind of, I guess, if there's like a takeaway that, if you want to have a, like you were saying, like the Sunday school lesson out of Esther, that would probably be it.
Yeah. I think there's like dozens at least of devotionals titled something like "For Such a Time as This."
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think because Jewish identity is so key to the Book of Esther, it is specifically her Jewish identity that she keeps hidden until she's able to reveal it. It is because they are Jews that Haman wants to send out this decree, because Mordecai won't bow down to him. So there's that sort of first reading, which we've already done and spoken to, but I think really to emphasize that Jewish identity is part of the Book of Esther. And so then as Christians reading it, I think it's really important for us to name that first. But then, of course, we are nothing other than who we are. That is, we read Christologically as Christians. And so that for the Book of Esther, that's a place where it really, I think, confronts us maybe more than some other books of the Bible, where, the word Jews or the Jewish people appears in Esther, and that term, that identifier, doesn't appear in some of the earlier biblical books. And so I think it's a real opportunity to remember the particularity of the Book of Esther, but then also to understand that particularity is part of the testimony to God that we understand too as Christians. And so to hold those two things together.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Thanks for bringing that up, Cameron. This is a very Jewish book, and we can't co-opt it, but we read it obviously through our own lenses. But yeah, in fact, in the history of interpretation, the Book of Esther has come up often when in times of persecution. So there's this rabbi from Berlin in the 1930s who wrote something like, I don't have the quotation in front of me, but he said, we read the Book of Esther at the Festival of Purim, which is the festival established in the Book of Esther. And every time we said Haman, the people heard Hitler, and the noise was deafening. right? The custom when you read the Book of Esther in the synagogue on Purim is every time the name Haman is read from the scroll, noisemakers are used, or people stomp their feet or yell in order to wipe out the name of Haman. And so this rabbi in 1930s Berlin said, every time the Jewish people there heard the name Haman, they thought Hitler, and they drowned out that name. But anyway, I wanted to just say one more, to say something about the other theme that I see in the Book of Esther, and that is the faithfulness of God, which again is probably an odd thing to say given that God isn't mentioned in the Book of Esther. But the rabbis who, the rabbis around Jesus' time and later, they saw God obliquely, or hinted at least, especially in that passage that I mentioned before that I now have in front of me, when Mordecai says to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Now, the rabbis said that phrase "another place" was a hint at God, that this was another name for God, another place, that relief and deliverance would arise from the Jews from another place. And it's really interesting because, why is Mordecai so sure that the Jews will be saved? And why, in fact, are Haman's wife and friends so sure that he will fall that Haman will be defeated by Mordecai, since Mordecai is a Jew? That's a chapter or two later in the book. Haman's own wife and friends say, if Mordecai is a Jew, you're sure to fall before him. So where does this assurance come from, or this, this idea that the Jews will be saved despite all appearances to the contrary? And where I would say from some assurance that God has promised to be faithful to the Jews, that they will remain a great nation. There's also a lot of coincidences in the story, and a lot of this is very humorous, as Cameron mentioned already, right? Esther, out of all the women of the empire, just happens to become queen. The king just happens to be unable to sleep on the night of the first banquet after Esther invites the king and Haman to two banquets. The night of the first banquet, the king just happens to have insomnia. The court records that are read to him just happen to be the ones that tell about Mordecai saving his life, another bit of the story that we skipped over. Haman just happens to come to the king's palace at just that point, and the king says, what should happen to the man whom the king wishes to honor? And Haman thinks, oh, well, it must be me. And so he says, well, put him on the king's horse and, put royal robes on him. And the king says, great, good idea. Do that to Mordecai, the Jew. And Haman, that's the beginning of Haman's downfall. Anyway, there's just so many coincidences. God is never mentioned in the book. But Mordecai is sure that help will arise from another place, and Haman's family is sure that he's doomed to fall before Mordecai the Jew, and there are all these coincidences that conspired to defeat Haman and save the Jews. One commentator who wrote on the Book of Esther, my advisor John Levinson, he put it this way. He said, it's like the old saying goes, a coincidence is a miracle in which God prefers to remain anonymous. So there's some hints, at least, of God's action in the Book of Esther. But the main thing really is this: the main reason I talk about God's faithfulness here is that the Jews survive, right? That the Book of Esther reveals something about the faithfulness of God. God calls Israel, God's people, into being way back in Genesis and Exodus. And somehow through the years, that people has survived and has continued to worship God in spite of, and like, persecution upon persecution. But the Babylonians today are no more, right? The Persians are no more. The Romans are no more. The Nazis are no more, please, God, right? But the Jewish people have survived. And that sheer historical fact that the Jews survive and continue to worship God, that sheer historical fact is enough to make me at least ponder the miraculous faithfulness of God. Right? So even though God isn't mentioned in the Book of Esther, even though that theme may not be obvious to everyone who reads it on first reading, I think Esther contributes to that story of God's faithfulness to the Jews through the centuries, because they're still here. Right? Thanks be to God. So that's what I would say about themes in the Book of Esther.
Wow, that's awesome.
Let me add one more thing, sorry. And that's just that, unfortunately, I think, and this goes back to something Cameron said about recognizing that this is about the Jews, and that is that, unfortunately, those endless persecutions of the Jews have often been, the fault of the church. The Nazis rose in Christian Europe, or at least nominally Christian Europe. So I think as we read Esther and as we think about the obstacles, the persecutions that the Jews have faced over the century, we also need to engage in some repentance for the church's role in that.
And anti-Semitism is sort of the oldest, racial discrimination. It's the oldest conspiracy theory. It just always seems to go there.
Yep. And we've seen it recently too. I mean, we've seen it in pop culture recently as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cameron, your thoughts?
Well, it's it's a heavy book in that way, but it is also a really good story.
Yes.
And I think that's something that I would want to end with about the Book of Esther, is that not to be afraid to read it like it's a really good story, to laugh at the places that seem laughable, to feel the ridiculousness of that king and the humor in the reversal of Haman being so set on having himself honored and making enemies of Mordecai, and then to have all of that go topsy-turvy. And that, I really love where it says, Mordecai says there in chapter 4, right before, maybe you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this, he says, who knows? And it says it right there in the Hebrew, who knows? There's this wonderful sort of maybe, like, this is all hard to comprehend, and there's so much suffering, and it's very difficult. And maybe one way to make sense of it is through this understanding of the providence of God that seems backgrounded there. And I like that maybe, because I think sometimes it's just so hard to make sense of a violent and terrible world, and a maybe is a comfort to me.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. I just want to add, this is, I mentioned Purim before, which is the festival established in the Book of Esther, and which happens, it's according to the Jewish calendar, so it's usually February or early March. If you ever get an opportunity to go to a synagogue for Purim festival, take it. It's like nothing you've ever seen. It's raucous, it's joyful, it's funny. There's a play put on always. I've been to several Purim festivals at a synagogue here in the Twin Cities, who has been kind enough to, my friend there has been kind enough to invite me. It's kind of a combination of Halloween and Mardi Gras, because people dress up in all kinds of costumes. You'll see Darth Vader next to, King Ahasuerus, next to, somebody from whatever, a person in a banana outfit. It's just so funny. But there's this underlying serious note, right? That there's an old joke that all Jewish festivals can be summed up with this description. They tried to kill us. They failed. Let's eat. So that applies to Passover. It applies to Hanukkah. It certainly applies to Purim as well. So there's a joy there, but with that underlying serious note of there's always a threat. I want to end by just describing reading a description of Purim and the Book of Esther from one of my favorite authors, Eugene Peterson, who wrote or translated the book, The Message. But he writes this in this wonderful little book called Five Smooth Stones, where he takes Esther and Ruth and Song of Songs and other of the smaller books and writes about them. But he says this about Esther and Purim. He says, in Purim, life together is celebrated as a joyous gift, snatched unbelievably from the gates of death and hell. A people who had faced the possibility of not being are emphatically alive. Community is not explained in historical terms. It is not analyzed in sociological terms. It is enjoyed in the language and rituals and food and laughter of a festival. The fact is that decimated and dispersed as the Jews were, they were not swallowed up in the ocean of pagan power and culture and religion. They survived by grace. The empire did not.
Who knows, man? Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for being our guest and Cameron for being our guest co-host today. This has been another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. And if you have enjoyed this episode or others, please rate and review our podcast in your favorite podcast app and be sure to share the podcast with a friend. Until next time.